The pharmacy security camera captured everything. Wade Montenegro's service weapon was pressed against Nora Griffin's forehead when she spoke the words that would end his career. "You should call Tyrone Blackwood right now." Wade's grip tightened on the trigger. "Shut your mouth," he screamed, shoving the barrel harder against her skin. The metallic click of the safety being released sent shockwaves through the dozen customers filming with trembling hands. 8-year-old Marcus in aisle 3 started crying as his mother pulled him behind the vitamin display. "Call him," Nora repeated calmly, blood trickling from where the gun barrel had broken her skin. Wade's face was purple with rage. "You think some ghetto name is going to save you?" But when Nora pulled out her federal badge with her free hand, the color drained from Wade's face like water from a broken dam. What nobody in that pharmacy knew was that Wade Montenegro had been terrorizing black customers for months, and that this moment, captured on 12 different phones, would expose a network of racial profiling that reached the highest levels of corporate security training, destroy multiple careers, and change how armed guards are deployed in American retail forever. Start from the beginning. 20 minutes earlier, Nora Griffin had pulled into the Peterson's Pharmacy parking lot on Peachtree Street in downtown Atlanta. The 28-year-old federal investigator was fighting a nasty head cold and needed something stronger than the over-the-counter medicine in her apartment. She'd chosen this particular pharmacy because it was close to the federal courthouse, where she'd just finished testifying in a major civil rights case. Nora had no idea that Wade Montenegro had been watching her since the moment she stepped out of her government-issued sedan. The 34-year-old security guard had been employed by Peterson's for 8 months, and in that time he'd developed what his supervisor would later call concerning patterns of behavior toward African-American customers. As Nora entered the climate-controlled pharmacy, the automatic doors sliding shut behind her, Wade was already reaching for his radio. "Got a suspicious individual entering the building," he muttered to no one in particular, his hand instinctively moving to the Glock 19 on his hip. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who would later review the footage. Nora Griffin, in her tailored navy blazer and professional demeanor, looked exactly like what she was, a federal law enforcement officer. But Wade Montenegro saw something different. He saw a young black woman in an expensive outfit who didn't belong in this upscale pharmacy. He saw an opportunity to assert his authority. He saw a target. Nora made her way to the cold and flu aisle, comparing the active ingredients in different decongestants. She was meticulous by nature. The same attention to detail that made her excellent at her job was now being applied to choosing between brand name and generic medications. She pulled out her phone to check if any of the ingredients would interact with her blood pressure medication. That's when Wade made his approach. "Excuse me, miss." His tone was already aggressive, his posture designed to intimidate. "What are you doing over there?" Nora looked up, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry?" "I asked what you're doing." Wade stepped closer, his hand now resting on his weapon. "You've been standing in that aisle for 5 minutes, looking around, checking your phone. That's suspicious behavior." The other customers in the pharmacy began to take notice. Dawn Patterson, a regular customer picking up her husband's heart medication, paused at the prescription counter. David Williams, a college student buying vitamins, started recording with his phone. Something about the security guard's tone set off alarm bells. "I'm shopping for cold medicine," Nora said evenly, holding up the 2 boxes she'd been comparing. "Is there a time limit I'm not aware of?" Wade's jaw tightened. He didn't like her tone. He didn't like her confidence. And he especially didn't like that she wasn't immediately submissive in the face of his authority. "Don't get smart with me. I saw you put something in your pocket." Nora's eyes narrowed slightly. She recognized what was happening. She'd investigated dozens of similar incidents in her career, but experiencing it firsthand was different. The adrenaline, the humiliation, the immediate understanding that one wrong move could escalate this beyond control. "I haven't put anything in my pocket," she said calmly, her training kicking in. "Would you like to check the security footage?" That question would later be identified as the moment Wade Montenegro's fate was sealed. Because unbeknownst to him, Nora Griffin wasn't just familiar with security protocols, she helped write them. As a federal investigator specializing in civil rights violations in retail environments, she knew exactly what questions to ask, to expose improper security procedures. But Wade Montenegro was too angry to think clearly, too convinced of his own authority, too blinded by his prejudices to recognize the trap he was walking into. "Empty your pockets, now." The pharmacy fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigeration units and the soft beeping of the security system. Every customer was now watching. Every phone was recording. And Nora Griffin made a decision that would change everything. "I'm not emptying my pockets," she said quietly, "but I am going to ask you one more time to call your supervisor. His name is Tyrone Blackwood. Tell him Agent Griffin is here." Wade Montenegro heard the word agent, but his rage was too consuming to process its implications. Instead, he did the one thing that would destroy his life, his career, and expose a systematic pattern of abuse that reached far beyond one pharmacy in Atlanta. He drew his weapon and pointed it at Nora Griffin's face. The next 60 minutes would change everything. But what Wade didn't realize was that pointing that gun was about to expose secrets that went all the way to corporate headquarters. The Glock 19 was 3 inches from Nora's forehead when David Williams's phone captured the moment that would later be viewed over 50 million times. The college student's hands were shaking so badly the video wobbled, but the audio was crystal clear. "Get on your knees right now!" Wade Montenegro's voice cracked with adrenaline as he screamed the command. Spittle flew from his mouth, landing on Nora's face. She didn't flinch. 8 years of federal law enforcement training had taught her that the moment you show fear to someone pointing a gun at you is the moment you lose control of the situation. "Sir, I need you to lower your weapon," Nora said, her voice steady despite her racing heartbeat. "You're committing a federal crime by threatening a law enforcement officer." But Wade was beyond reason. The power rush of holding a gun to someone's head had triggered something primal in him, something that his supervisor, Tyrone Blackwood, had noticed during Wade's psychological evaluation 8 months ago, but hadn't acted on quickly enough. "Shut up and get down." Wade's finger moved to the trigger. "I don't care who you think you are." Dawn Patterson dropped her prescription bag, pills scattering across the linoleum floor as she backed toward the exit. The young mother with Marcus pressed herself and her son against the vitamin display, her own phone out and recording. The pharmacist, Dr. Rebecca Martinez, was already on the phone with 911, her voice urgent but controlled. "We have an armed security guard threatening a customer at Peterson's Pharmacy on Peachtree. We need police immediately." If you believe that no one should ever have a gun pointed at their face because of the color of their skin, type justice in the comments below. Tuestupa, what the growing crowd of witnesses didn't know was that this exact scenario had been playing out in retail locations across Atlanta for months. Wade Montenegro wasn't acting alone. He was following training protocols that had been quietly implemented by Blackstone Security Services, the private company contracted by Peterson's pharmacy chain. The training was never written down, never officially documented. It was passed along in whispered conversations during shift changes, reinforced through performance reviews that rewarded proactive security measures and incentivized through bonuses for theft prevention. But what it really was systematic racial profiling with a corporate veneer. Nora knew this because she'd been investigating Blackstone Security for 6 months. The federal case she'd just finished testifying about that morning involved 3 other retail chains that used Blackstone's services. The pattern was always the same. Young black customers harassed, detained without cause, sometimes assaulted, always humiliated. The companies paid settlements, signed non-disclosure agreements, and the pattern continued. But this was different. This was her with a gun to her head. This was personal. "Wade Montenegro," she said, reading his name tag while staring down the barrel of his weapon. "Employee ID 4472, hired 8 months ago. Failed your first psychological evaluation, but was cleared for duty anyway because Blackstone Security needed to fill quotas." Wade's eyes widened. How could she possibly know that information? "Your training supervisor was Ivan Weatherby. You were specifically instructed to focus your attention on, and I quote, urban-looking individuals who don't fit the customer demographic." The gun began to shake in Wade's hands. Every word Nora spoke was being recorded by multiple phones. Every detail would later be verified by federal investigators. Every revelation would become evidence in what would become the largest civil rights case in retail security history. You received a $200 bonus last month for what your supervisor called proactive engagement with high-risk individuals. Want to guess what the demographic breakdown of your high-risk individuals was? Doctor. Martinez, still on the phone with 911, could see police cars pulling into the parking lot through the front windows. But she also noticed something else. More customers were arriving, unaware of the situation inside. She made a decision that probably saved lives. She hit the store's lockdown button, securing all entrances and activating the emergency lighting system that would alert arriving officers to an active threat situation. Wade noticed the lights change and panicked. "What did you do? What did you do?" "I didn't do anything," Nora said calmly. "Dr. Martinez just activated Protocol 7 Alpha, which means this building is now under federal jurisdiction. Every word you've said, every action you've taken, is being recorded not just by these customers, but by the pharmacy's security system, which uploads directly to corporate servers." That was when Wade Montenegro realized he might be in real trouble, but it was far too late. The first police officer through the secured entrance was Sergeant Jennifer Torres, a 15-year veteran of the Atlanta Police Department who had worked dozens of similar calls. But when she saw the scene, a security guard pointing a weapon at what appeared to be a professional woman surrounded by terrified customers, her training kicked in immediately. "Atlanta PD, drop your weapon!" Wade spun around, his gun still drawn, and made the second biggest mistake of his life. Instead of immediately complying, he shouted back, "I'm security. She's robbing the store." That's when Nora Griffin did something that would be replayed in law enforcement training academies for years to come. With a gun still pointed in her direction and police officers shouting commands, she slowly reached into her blazer and pulled out her federal credentials. "Agent Nora Griffin, Civil Rights Division," she announced clearly. "This man has been holding me at gunpoint for approximately 4 minutes. Everything has been recorded." The silence that followed was deafening. But what happened next would expose just how deep this conspiracy really went. Sergeant Torres's radio crackled to life as she processed what she was seeing. "Dispatch, we're going to need federal liaisons on scene. We have a credentialed federal agent who appears to have been threatened by private security." Wade Montenegro's world began to collapse in real time. The gun in his hands suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. The federal badge in Nora's hands might as well have been a nuclear weapon. And the dozen phones still recording meant that there was no way to spin this, no way to claim misunderstanding, no way to make this go away. But Wade wasn't the only one whose life was about to change forever. 2 miles away, in the gleaming corporate offices of Blackstone Security Services, CEO Richard Pemberton was reviewing quarterly profits when his assistant burst into his office without knocking. "Sir, you need to see this." It's already going viral. The video on her tablet showed Wade Montenegro holding a gun to a woman's head in a Peterson's pharmacy. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the timestamp, 4:23 p.m., which meant this was happening right now live, as customers continued to live stream the confrontation on social media. "How many views?" Pemberton asked, his stomach dropping. 200,000 and climbing, and sir, there's more. She's a federal agent. She's been investigating us." Pemberton's blood ran cold. Because if Agent Griffin had been investigating Blackstone Security, then she knew about the training protocols. She knew about the bonuses. She knew about the systematic targeting of black customers that had generated an additional $3 million in theft prevention revenue over the past year. Back at the pharmacy, Sergeant Torres had secured Wade's weapon and called for backup. But the situation was far from over. As soon as Nora showed her credentials, the dynamic in the room shifted completely. The terrified customers realized they hadn't just witnessed harassment, they'd witnessed a federal crime. The pharmacist understood that her store was now a crime scene. And Wade Montenegro finally grasped that he wasn't just losing his job, he was going to prison. "Agent Griffin," Sergeant Torres said respectfully, "can you give me a preliminary statement about what happened here?" "Absolutely." Nora's voice was steady, professional. "At approximately 4:03 p.m., I entered this pharmacy to purchase over-the-counter medication, At approximately 4:08 p.m., Mr. Montenegro approached me without cause and began what I recognized as a discriminatory security harassment protocol. When I identified myself as a federal agent and requested he contact his supervisor, he drew his weapon and held me at gunpoint for approximately 4 minutes. Each word was chosen carefully. Each detail would later be corroborated by video evidence. Each statement would become part of a federal indictment that would reshape how private security operates in retail environments across the United States. But David Williams, the college student who had been recording everything, noticed something else. "Officer," he called out, "there's something weird about what she said earlier, about bonuses and training protocols. How would she know that stuff if she was just a random customer?" Sergeant Torres looked at Nora, who smiled for the first time since this ordeal began. "Because I've been investigating Blackstone Security Services for 6 months. Mr. Montenegro just provided the final piece of evidence I needed for a federal civil rights prosecution." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. This wasn't a random incident of racial profiling. This was a federal sting operation that had just concluded with the suspect literally handing over the evidence by pointing a gun at the investigating officer. Wade Montenegro's knees buckled. He had just confessed to systematic racial profiling while threatening a federal agent with a deadly weapon, all captured on multiple video recordings that were already spreading across social media platforms faster than Blackstone's crisis management team could possibly contain. Dawn Patterson, who had been quietly gathering her scattered medication, spoke up for the first time. "Officer, I want to make a statement too. This man has harassed my son 3 times in the past month. Every time he comes in here to buy acne medication, this security guard follows him around like he's going to steal something." "Same here," said the young mother with Marcus. "Last week, he made my teenage daughter empty her purse in front of everyone just because she was looking at lip balm. She's 15 years old." One by one, other customers began sharing their experiences. The pattern became undeniable. Wade Montenegro hadn't just threatened a federal agent, he had been systematically terrorizing black customers for months, following protocols that were about to be exposed as part of a much larger conspiracy. Dr. Martinez, the pharmacist, quietly approached Sergeant Torres with a manila folder. "Officer, you should see these incident reports. Corporate told us to file them but never follow up. There are dozens." As Torres flipped through page after page of complaints against Wade Montenegro, all involving black customers, all dismissed by management, all following the same pattern, Nora pulled out her phone and made a call that would change everything. "Tyrone, it's Agent Griffin. We got him and we got everything." But the phone call that Wade should have made was about to reveal just how high this conspiracy really went. The black Escalade pulled into the Peterson's Pharmacy parking lot exactly 12 minutes after Nora's phone call. Tyrone Blackwood stepped out of the vehicle with the measured precision of someone who had been preparing for this moment for months. The 45-year-old federal supervisor cut an imposing figure, 6'2", impeccably dressed in a charcoal suit, with the kind of presence that immediately commanded attention. But Tyrone wasn't just Nora's supervisor. He was the lead investigator on Operation Clean Sweep, a federal task force that had been documenting systematic civil rights violations in retail security across 7 states. And Wade Montenegro had just handed them the perfect case study. Inside the pharmacy, Wade was sitting in handcuffs, his head in his hands, finally understanding the magnitude of what he had done. When the automatic doors opened and Tyrone walked in, flanked by 2 other federal agents, Wade looked up with the expression of someone watching his own execution. "Agent Griffin," Tyrone said with a slight smile, "interesting way to conclude an investigation." "Sometimes the evidence comes to you," Nora replied, dabbing at the cut on her forehead where Wade's gun had broken the skin. "Meet Wade Montenegro, employee 4472 of Blackstone Security Services. He's been very helpful in demonstrating their training protocols." Sergeant Torres approached Tyrone with professional courtesy. "Sir, I assume you'll be taking jurisdiction of this case." "We will. This incident is part of a larger federal investigation into civil rights violations in retail security. Agent Griffin has been working undercover for 6 months documenting these patterns. The word undercover sent shockwaves through the remaining customers. David Williams, still recording, realized he had captured something much bigger than a security guard losing his temper. Dawn Patterson understood why Agent Griffin had seemed so calm under pressure, and Dr. Martinez finally grasped why corporate had been so insistent on hiring Blackstone Security, despite the constant complaints. But it was Wade Montenegro who understood the full implications. "Do you set me up?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "No, Mr. Montenegro," Tyrone said, walking over to where Wade sat cuffed to a pharmacy chair. "You set yourself up. Every time you harassed an innocent customer. Every time you followed corporate protocols that you knew were wrong. Every time you took a bonus for what you called proactive engagement with people who looked different than you." Tyrone opened a briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "Let me read you some statistics, Mr. Montenegro. In the 8 months you've worked at this location, you've detained or harassed 47 customers. Want to guess what percentage of those customers were black?" Wade didn't answer. 93%, 44 out of 47. But here's the interesting part. According to the pharmacy's customer demographics, black customers represent only 22% of their clientele. So either you're the most unlucky security guard in Atlanta, or you're following a pattern. The mathematics of discrimination laid out in stark terms. Every number Tyrone cited would later be verified by data analysis experts. Every percentage would become evidence in a federal prosecution that would result in the largest civil rights settlement in retail security history. Agent Nova Weatherby, the third federal agent to arrive on scene, began setting up recording equipment. The informal interview was about to become an official federal interrogation, and everything Wade said would be used to map the entire network of discriminatory practices that Blackstone Security had implemented across their client base. "Mr. Montenegro," Tyrone continued, "you have the right to remain silent. But before you exercise that right, I want you to understand something. This investigation doesn't end with you. We have documented evidence of systematic training protocols designed to target minority customers. We have financial records showing performance bonuses tied to harassment statistics. We have corporate emails discussing customer demographic management." Wade's face went white. He finally understood that he wasn't just a security guard who had made a mistake. He was a foot soldier in a systematic campaign of racial profiling that had been designed, implemented, and incentivized by people far above his pay grade. "The question now," Tyrone said, taking a seat across from Wade, "is whether you want to be prosecuted as a participant in this conspiracy, or whether you want to help us expose the people who created it." For the first time since pulling his weapon, Wade Montenegro saw a possible path to redemption. It would require him to admit everything. It would require him to testify against his supervisors, his trainers, and the corporate executives who had created the system he had been following. It would require him to acknowledge that his actions had been motivated by racial prejudice that had been systematically encouraged and rewarded. But it might also be his only chance to avoid spending the next 10 years in federal prison. Dr. Martinez, who had been quietly observing from behind the prescription counter, approached Agent Nova Weatherby with another folder. "Ma'am, I think you should see these. They're corporate communications about security protocols. I've been keeping copies because something felt wrong about what we were being asked to do." Agent Weatherby opened the folder and immediately understood why Dr. Martinez had looked uncomfortable for months. The emails were explicitly discriminatory, using coded language to instruct pharmacy staff to pay special attention to certain customers, to alert security when specific demographic profiles entered the store, and to prioritize loss prevention in ways that clearly targeted minority customers. As more evidence piled up, Wade Montenegro realized that his choice was simple: become the face of systematic racism in retail security, or help expose the system that had created him. The decision that would determine his future was about to be captured on federal recording equipment, witnessed by the same customers he had terrorized, and would ultimately help dismantle one of the most sophisticated discrimination networks ever uncovered in American retail. But what Wade Montenegro revealed next would destroy everything Blackstone Security had built and expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of corporate America. Wade Montenegro looked around the pharmacy at the faces of the customers he had terrorized. Dawn Patterson, whose son he had followed and harassed, David Williams, whose camera had captured his crimes, the young mother whose teenage daughter he had humiliated. Then he looked at Agent Griffin, whose forehead still bore the mark where his gun barrel had cut her skin. "I'll talk," he whispered. Those two words would bring down a multi-million-dollar conspiracy. Agent Nova Weatherby pressed record on the federal recording device as Tyrone Blackwood read Wade his rights for the second time, ensuring that everything he was about to say would be admissible in federal court. The pharmacy had become an impromptu interrogation room, and Wade Montenegro was about to become the key witness in the largest civil rights case in retail security history. "State your name and position for the record," Tyrone instructed. "Wade Montenegro, employee ID 4472, security officer for Blackstone Security Services, assigned to Peterson's pharmacy location, 1247. How long have you been employed by Blackstone Security?" 8 months, 2 weeks, 3 days. Wade's precision was the result of counting every day since he had started a job that he now realized had been designed to turn him into a criminal. "Describe your training process." Wade took a deep breath. What he was about to reveal would expose not just his own actions, but a systematic program of discrimination that had been carefully crafted to provide legal cover while achieving illegal results. The official training was 3 days of classroom instruction and 2 days of field observation. But the real training happened after that, during what they called cultural integration periods with senior security officers. "Explain what you mean by real training." Ivan Weatherby, the training supervisor, pulled me aside after my first week. He said the classroom stuff was just for corporate liability, but that if I wanted to succeed, I needed to understand the operational realities of retail security. Dawn Patterson shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the man who had been terrorizing her family had been trained by someone with the same last name as the federal agent, now investigating the case. The coincidence felt surreal, but the situation was far too serious for irony. "What did Ivan Weatherby tell you about these operational realities?" He said that different customer demographics presented different risk profiles, that young black males were statistically more likely to shoplift, that black women in professional attire were often using stolen credit cards to buy expensive items they planned to return for cash, that I should pay special attention to anyone who didn't fit the neighborhood demographic. Each word was being recorded, time-stamped, and would later be corroborated by testimony from other Blackstone security employees who had received identical training. The systematic nature of the discrimination was becoming undeniable. Were these instructions provided in writing? Never. Ivan was very clear about that. He said putting anything in writing would create unnecessary legal exposure for the company. Everything was verbal, passed down from trainer to new employee, reinforced through performance reviews. Agent Griffin, who had been listening intently while a paramedic treated her forehead wound, interjected with a question that would later prove crucial to the federal prosecution. "Wade, how were these instructions reinforced through performance reviews?" Wade looked at her with something approaching remorse. "Every month we had to submit incident reports. The more security interventions we documented, the higher our performance scores, and higher scores meant bonuses." How much were these bonuses? $50 for every theft prevention intervention, $200 for any incident that resulted in police involvement, $500 for any case that led to arrest or prosecution. The financial incentive structure was now clear. Blackstone Security had created a system that directly rewarded harassment of minority customers with cold, hard cash. The more innocent people their guards harassed, the more money they made. Tyrone pulled out a calculator and began running numbers. "Wade, in 8 months, how much bonus money did you earn through these interventions?" Wade was quiet for a long moment. "Approximately $3,200. "And what percentage of those interventions involved black customers?" "All of them." The admission hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Wade Montenegro had just confessed to earning $3,200 in bonuses for systematically harassing innocent black customers over 8 months, and he was just one guard at one location of a company that operated across 7 states. Agent Nova Weatherby was already calculating the scope of the conspiracy in her head. If Wade's numbers were representative across Blackstone's 847 retail security assignments, the company had potentially generated millions of dollars through systematic racial profiling while creating a paper trail of false incident reports that could support federal RICO charges. Wade, Tyrone continued, did Ivan Weatherby or any other supervisor ever explicitly tell you to target customers based on race? Not explicitly. They used code words, urban demographics, high-risk individuals, customers who don't match the local customer base. But we all knew what they meant. There were PowerPoint presentations that showed pictures of suspicious behavior, and somehow all the suspicious people in the photos were black or Hispanic. Martinez, who had been quietly listening from behind the prescription counter, stepped forward with yet another folder. Agents, I think you need to see these too. They're the cultural sensitivity training materials that corporate sent us last month. I kept them because something felt wrong about the content. As Agent Weatherby flipped through the materials, she found exactly what she expected. A sophisticated program designed to teach employees how to discriminate while maintaining plausible deniability. The language was careful, the examples were coded, but the intent was unmistakable. Wade Montenegro had just provided the missing piece of a federal case that would ultimately result in $23. $7 million in settlements, the complete restructuring of private security protocols in retail environments, and criminal charges against 17 corporate executives. But first, they had to map the entire network. What Wade revealed next would expose the names and locations of everyone involved in this conspiracy. Tyrone Blackwood pulled up a digital map of Atlanta on his tablet and placed it in front of Wade Montenegro. Red dots marked every location where Blackstone Security provided services. 47 retail establishments across the metropolitan area, from upscale pharmacies to discount clothing stores, from electronics retailers to grocery chains. Wade, I want you to look at this map and tell me which locations you've visited for additional training or special assignments. Wade's finger traced across the screen, stopping at dot after dot. Here, this one too, and this entire shopping complex. By the time he finished, he had identified 23 locations where he had either worked temporary assignments or attended what Blackstone called cross-training sessions. And at each of these locations, you received the same instructions about operational realities and customer demographics. Identical, word for word sometimes, like it was a script. Agent Nova Weatherby was building a comprehensive database in real time, cross-referencing Wade's testimony with incident reports, customer complaints, and financial records that federal investigators had been collecting for months. The pattern was undeniable. Blackstone Security had created a systematic program of racial profiling that generated revenue through false incident reports, while terrorizing innocent customers across the entire Atlanta metropolitan area. If this story is giving you chills and you want to show maximum support, look for that hype button right next to the like button. It's YouTube's new way to show extreme enthusiasm and helps push stories like this to more people who need to hear them. Then comment your country and city below so we can see where justice warriors are watching from around the world. Wade, Agent Griffin said, her professional demeanor masking the personal satisfaction of seeing her investigation come together. Tell us about the regional training conferences. Wade's eyes widened. The federal agents knew about the conferences, the quarterly meetings where Blackstone's most successful security officers shared tactics and strategies with newer employees. What Wade didn't know was that Agent Griffin had been tracking these conferences for months, building a network map of exactly how discriminatory practices were spread throughout the company. They called them best practices seminars. Every 3 months, the top-performing officers from each region would meet at a hotel conference room to discuss advanced security techniques. Who ran these seminars? Regional Director Marcus Pemberton, Richard's son, corporate training specialist Jennifer Morrison, and usually 1 or 2 star performers who would present case studies. Each name Wade mentioned was already in federal files. Marcus Pemberton, son of the CEO, had been under surveillance for 2 months. Jennifer Morrison's emails were being analyzed by federal forensic accountants. And the star performers had been identified through performance bonus records, that Blackstone Security thought were confidential. Describe what happened at these seminars. They would show PowerPoint presentations with statistics about theft patterns, customer demographics, and intervention success rates. But the real information came during the breakout sessions, when individual trainers would pull small groups aside and explain the practical applications of the statistical data. Dr. Martinez, who had been listening to every word while managing prescription orders, approached with yet another folder. Agents, I've been thinking about something. Every month, corporate sends us customer service improvement surveys that ask specific questions about security interactions. I think you should see the actual questions. Agent Weatherby opened the folder and found surveys that were designed to gather data about racial profiling while maintaining plausible deniability. Questions like, how often do security personnel engage with customers who appear unfamiliar with store layout? And what percentage of security interactions involve customers who seem nervous or uncomfortable? Were clearly coded language for tracking harassment of minority customers. Wade, Tyrone continued, these surveys that Dr. Martinez mentioned, did Blackstone use them to evaluate your performance? Every month, my supervisor would go over the survey results and tell me which locations needed more proactive security presence based on the customer comfort data. The sophistication of the discrimination network was becoming clear. Blackstone Security had created a data-driven system for deploying racial profiling across their entire client base, using customer surveys and incident reports to optimize harassment while maintaining corporate legal cover. But Agent Griffin had one more question that would expose the true scope of the conspiracy. Wade, during these training sessions and conferences, did anyone ever discuss legal risks or potential civil rights violations? Wade was quiet for a long moment, understanding that his next answer would implicate people far above his pay grade in knowing willful civil rights violations. Regional Director Pemberton addressed that specifically. He said that as long as we documented everything as security concerns and theft prevention, we were protected by corporate policies. He said the legal department had reviewed all our procedures and given them full approval. That admission would later prove that Blackstone Security's legal department had knowingly approved systematic racial profiling, transforming the case from individual discrimination incidents into a corporate conspiracy that violated federal civil rights laws at the highest levels. As Agent Weatherby continued building the evidence database, Dawn Patterson approached Wade Montenegro with surprising compassion. "Young man," she said quietly, "I want you to know that I don't hate you. But I need you to understand that what you did to my son, following him around this store like he was a criminal, when he was just trying to buy medicine for his acne, that changed how he sees himself. That changed how he moves through the world." Wade looked at her with tears in his eyes. For the first time since this ordeal began, he was seeing the human cost of the system he had been part of. Not just statistics or incident reports, but real people whose lives had been damaged by his actions. "Dawn," he whispered, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I'm sorry." The personal moment of accountability was being recorded along with everything else, preserving not just the legal evidence of systematic discrimination, but the human impact of corporate policies designed to dehumanize and terrorize innocent people based solely on the color of their skin. While Wade Montenegro confessed to federal agents in an Atlanta pharmacy, chaos was erupting in the corporate boardroom of Blackstone Security Services. CEO Richard Pemberton stood at the head of a mahogany conference table, watching his $847 million company collapse in real time on social media feeds displayed across multiple monitors. "Sir," his communications director Jennifer Walsh said urgently, "the video has been shared 3 million times in the last hour. The Blackstone racism is trending nationwide. And the worst part, people are posting their own videos of similar incidents at our other client locations." The hashtag had unleashed a flood of previously unreported incidents. Cell phone videos from shopping malls, grocery stores, and retail chains across 7 states showed Blackstone security guards following black customers, demanding to search purses and backpacks, calling police for suspicious behavior that appeared to be nothing more than normal shopping. Each video was time-stamped, geotagged, and provided clear evidence of the systematic nature of the discrimination. Richard Pemberton's son Marcus burst into the boardroom without knocking, his face pale with panic. "Dad, we have a problem. The federal agents aren't just investigating the pharmacy incident. They know about the training conferences. They know about the bonus structure. They know about everything." The revelation hit the room like a bomb. If federal investigators had detailed knowledge of Blackstone's internal operations, it meant they had been under surveillance for months, possibly years. Every training session, every performance review, every best practices seminar had potentially been monitored by federal agents building a comprehensive case. Legal counsel Patricia Sterling, who had been reviewing federal civil rights statutes since the video first surfaced, looked up from her legal briefs with grim news. "We're looking at potential RICO charges. If they can prove that the discrimination was systematic and financially motivated, this becomes a federal racketeering case. We could be facing criminal prosecution for the executives and civil liability in the hundreds of millions." The financial implications were staggering. Blackstone Securities' stock price had already dropped 47% since the video went viral. Major retail clients were terminating contracts in real time, unwilling to be associated with a company accused of systematic racism. Insurance companies were reviewing coverage policies, and federal prosecutors were likely preparing the kind of comprehensive case that had destroyed larger corporations for lesser crimes. But Richard Pemberton was more concerned about protecting his family's personal assets than the company's survival. "Patricia, what are our options for containing this?" "Containment is no longer possible," she replied grimly. "The evidence is public, the federal investigation is active, and the victims are talking. Our only option is cooperation and damage control." Meanwhile, back at the pharmacy, Agent Griffin was receiving updates from her team about the corporate response. "Tyrone," she said, reading messages on her secure phone, "Blackstone's legal team is already reaching out through back channels. They want to discuss a settlement." "Too late for that," Tyrone replied. "We're past the point where this can be resolved with money and non-disclosure agreements. Wade's confession has given us everything we need for criminal charges." Wade Montenegro, still handcuffed but now fully cooperating, overheard the conversation and realized that his decision to confess had triggered consequences far beyond his own case. "Agent Blackwood," he said hesitantly, "there's something else you need to know about the data collection." "What data collection?" "Every interaction we had with customers was logged in a database. Names, addresses, physical descriptions, license plate numbers when possible. Corporate said it was for security trend analysis, but we were required to note race and estimated income level for every person we detained or questioned." The admission revealed another layer of the conspiracy. Blackstone Security had been building detailed profiles of minority customers across their entire client base, creating what amounted to a discriminatory surveillance network that violated federal privacy laws in addition to civil rights statutes. Agent Nova Weatherby immediately contacted federal data specialists to secure Blackstone servers before the company could destroy evidence. The database Wade described would contain names and personal information for potentially thousands of innocent people who had been targeted solely because of their race. Dr. Martinez, who had been quietly managing the pharmacy while federal agents conducted their investigation, approached with disturbing news. "Agents, I just received a call from corporate. They're terminating our contract with Blackstone Security, effective immediately, and want me to surrender all documentation related to security incidents." "Don't surrender anything," Agent Griffin instructed. "As of this moment, all Blackstone-related materials in this pharmacy are evidence in a federal investigation. We'll need to secure everything before corporate can attempt to destroy records." The scope of evidence preservation was expanding rapidly. What had begun as a single incident of discrimination had evolved into a federal investigation, requiring the seizure of corporate servers, training materials, financial records, and incident reports from dozens of retail locations across multiple states. Back in the Blackstone boardroom, Richard Pemberton was facing the reality that his company's discriminatory practices had been so systematic and well documented that federal prosecutors would have no difficulty proving criminal intent. The video of Wade Montenegro pointing a gun at Agent Griffin was just the tip of an evidentiary iceberg that included financial records, training materials, email communications, and now Wade's detailed confession about the company's internal operations. "Sir," his assistant announced, "Agent Tyrone Blackwood is on line 1. He says it's urgent." Pemberton took the call knowing it would determine whether his company would face civil liability or criminal prosecution. The conversation that followed would be recorded, analyzed by federal prosecutors, and would ultimately seal the fate of everyone involved in creating and implementing Blackstone Securities' systematic discrimination network. The next 30 minutes would determine whether this case would result in the largest civil rights settlement in corporate history or criminal charges that could send executives to federal prison for decades. But what Tyrone Blackwood told Richard Pemberton would force a decision that would change the lives of everyone involved. "Mr. Pemberton," Agent Tyrone Blackwood's voice was calm but carried the weight of federal authority as it filled the Blackstone Security boardroom through the conference phone speaker. "I'm calling to inform you that your employee Wade Montenegro has provided detailed testimony about systematic civil rights violations implemented by your company across multiple states." Richard Pemberton's hands trembled as he activated the recorder that would capture everything said during this call, a decision his legal team would later regret when the recording became evidence in federal court. Around the conference table, 17 executives and legal advisors listened in silence as their careers and freedom hung in the balance. "Agent Blackwood," Pemberton replied, his voice carefully controlled, "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Blackstone Security operates under the highest ethical standards, with comprehensive training programs designed to prevent exactly the kind of incident you're describing. Mr. Pemberton, let me be very clear about what we have documented. Your company has been operating a systematic program of racial profiling that generated approximately $14.7 million in false incident reports and fraudulent performance bonuses over the past 3 years. We have financial records, training materials, email communications, database records, and now detailed testimony from one of your employees describing the entire operation. The number? $14.10 million. Hit the room like a physical blow. None of the executives had realized the scope of revenue that had been generated through discriminatory practices, but federal forensic accountants had been tracking every bonus payment, every fraudulent incident report, and every contract renewal that had been secured through inflated security intervention statistics. Legal counsel Patricia Sterling frantically scribbled notes while calculating the potential criminal exposure. Under federal civil rights laws, systematic discrimination with financial motivation could result in RICO charges carrying sentences of up to 20 years per count. With multiple states involved and hundreds of documented victims, the criminal exposure was potentially catastrophic. "Agent Blackwood," Sterling interjected, "this is Patricia Sterling, General Counsel for Blackstone Security. We would like to discuss the possibility of cooperation and resolution." "Ms. Sterling, cooperation was an option before your employee pointed a loaded weapon at a federal agent. Now we're in criminal territory. However, I am authorized to offer one alternative to federal prosecution." The silence in the boardroom was absolute. 17 careers, thousands of jobs, and hundreds of millions in corporate assets hinged on Tyrone Blackwood's next words. Complete corporate restructuring under federal oversight. Full financial restitution to all identified victims. Termination of all executives involved in creating or implementing discriminatory policies. And transformation of Blackstone Security into a model for civil rights compliance in private security services. The ultimatum was comprehensive and devastating. It would essentially destroy the current corporate structure while preserving the company's ability to operate under federal supervision. For Richard Pemberton, it meant losing control of the company his father had founded 40 years earlier. For his son Marcus and the other executives involved in training programs, it meant the end of their careers in security services. But the alternative was federal prison. "How long do we have to consider this offer?" Pemberton asked. "You have until 9 a.m. tomorrow morning. After that, federal prosecutors will seek criminal indictments against all identified co-conspirators. Back at the pharmacy, Agent Griffin was coordinating with federal teams across 7 states to simultaneously secure evidence at Blackstone client locations before the company could destroy records. The scope of the operation was unprecedented. 42 locations, 847 security guards, potentially thousands of victims, and a paper trail that stretched back 3 years. Wade Montenegro, still providing testimony, had become the key to understanding how the discrimination network operated at ground level. "Agent Griffin," he said, "there's something else." The quarterly conferences weren't just training sessions, they were competitions. Regions competed against each other for highest intervention rates and most successful theft prevention statistics. The winning region got additional funding and equipment. The competitive element added another layer to the systematic discrimination. Blackstone Security had gamified racial profiling, creating incentives for guards to harass as many minority customers as possible while generating false documentation to justify their actions. Agent Nova Weatherby was building prosecution charts that would be used in federal court, mapping the relationships between corporate executives, regional supervisors, training specialists, and individual guards. The organizational structure revealed clear lines of authority and communication that would make it impossible for executives to claim ignorance of discriminatory practices. "Wade," Agent Griffin continued, "during these competitions were specific targets or quotas discussed. Every quarter, regional directors would set performance objectives for intervention rates. The number always seemed to correlate with the racial demographics of the locations we were assigned to. Areas with higher black populations got higher intervention quotas. The correlation between racial demographics and harassment quotas provided mathematical proof of intentional discrimination. Federal data analysts would later confirm that Blackstone's intervention rates directly corresponded to Census Bureau racial demographic data, creating a statistical pattern that would be impossible to explain as coincidental. Dawn Patterson, who had been listening to Wade's testimony while waiting for her prescription to be processed, spoke up with a question that would prove crucial to the federal case. "Young man, when you and other guards compared your numbers at these conferences, did anyone ever question whether what you were doing was legal?" Wade was quiet for a long moment. Marcus Pemberton, the regional director, addressed that during my second conference. He said the legal department had reviewed all our procedures and confirmed that as long as we followed proper documentation protocols, we were protected by qualified immunity and corporate indemnification policies. That admission would prove that Blackstone's legal department had not only been aware of the discriminatory practices, but had provided explicit guidance on how to implement them while avoiding prosecution. The involvement of corporate legal counsel would eliminate any possibility of claiming that discrimination was the result of rogue employees acting against company policy. As the federal net closed around Blackstone Security, Richard Pemberton faced the most difficult decision of his corporate career. Accept federal oversight and personal humiliation, or risk decades in prison defending a systematic discrimination network that had been built for profit and maintained through corporate conspiracy. The decision he made would determine not only his personal fate, but the future of private security regulation across the United States. But what Richard Pemberton decided would shock everyone involved and change the course of corporate accountability forever. At 11:47 p.m., nearly 8 hours after Wade Montenegro had pointed a gun at Agent Nora Griffin, Richard Pemberton stood alone in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the Blackstone Tower, staring out at the Atlanta skyline while his company collapsed around him. The weight of his decision would affect not just his own fate, but the lives of 3,247 employees, thousands of victims, and the future of private security regulation in America. His phone buzzed with a text from his son Marcus. "Dad, whatever you decide, I'm with you, but remember, we're not just fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for the family legacy." That text would later be seized by federal investigators and used as evidence that the Pembertons viewed their criminal conspiracy as a matter of family honor rather than corporate accountability. It would prove particularly damaging during sentencing hearings when federal judges considered whether the executives showed genuine remorse for their actions. Pemberton picked up his secure phone and dialed Agent Blackwood's direct number. The call that followed would be recorded, analyzed by federal prosecutors, and would ultimately determine whether this case ended with corporate cooperation or criminal prosecution. "Agent Blackwood," Pemberton said, his voice steady despite the circumstances, "this is Richard Pemberton. I've considered your ultimatum, and I have a response." "I'm listening, Mr. Pemberton." "Blackstone Security rejects your terms. We will not admit to systematic discrimination that never existed. We will not surrender corporate control to federal oversight. And we will not accept responsibility for the actions of individual employees who exceeded their training and authority." The silence on the other end of the line lasted exactly 17 seconds, long enough for Agent Blackwood to activate emergency protocols that would secure evidence at 42 locations simultaneously before Blackstone could destroy records. "Mr. Pemberton, are you certain that's your final decision?" "Agent Blackwood, my family built this company on the principle of providing security services to law-abiding businesses and their customers. If individual employees have violated that mission, they should be held accountable for their personal choices. But Blackstone Security will not accept liability for actions we never authorized, policies we never implemented, and discrimination we never condoned." Every word of Pemberton's statement contradicted the evidence that federal investigators had collected over months of surveillance. Training materials, email communications, financial records, and Wade Montenegro's detailed testimony had documented systematic discrimination that was designed, implemented, and incentivized at the highest corporate levels. But Pemberton's defiance would prove to be a strategic miscalculation that would result in criminal charges far more severe than those originally contemplated by federal prosecutors. Back at the pharmacy, Agent Griffin received notification that Blackstone had rejected federal cooperation terms. "Tyrone's activating Protocol 7, she told Agent Nova Weatherby. "Full evidence seizure, immediate asset freezing, and criminal referrals for all identified co-conspirators." Wade Montenegro, who had been listening to updates throughout the evening, understood that his former employer's decision to fight rather than cooperate had just eliminated any possibility of leniency for the executives who had created the system he had been following. "Agent Griffin," Wade said quietly, "there's something else I need to tell you, something that Richard Pemberton doesn't know I know." "What is it, Wade?" 6 months ago, I was selected for a special assignment. Corporate security wanted me to document irregular customer behavior patterns at high-end retail locations. They gave me special recording equipment and told me to focus on demographic anomalies. Black customers shopping at luxury stores, basically. Wade pulled a small digital recorder from his shoe and handed it to Agent Nova Weatherby. "I recorded everything. Every training session, every supervisor meeting, every conversation where they told us to target people based on race. I kept it as insurance in case something like this happened." The digital recorder contained over 40 hours of recordings that would prove systematic discrimination at the highest corporate levels. Conversations between regional directors discussing customer demographic management, training sessions explaining how to harass minority customers while avoiding legal liability, and explicit instructions to target black shoppers at upscale retailers. Agent Weatherby immediately secured the device and contacted federal digital forensics specialists. The recordings would provide irrefutable evidence of criminal conspiracy that would make Pemberton's denials look like deliberate perjury rather than corporate defense. Meanwhile, federal agents were simultaneously raiding Blackstone security offices in Atlanta, Birmingham, Charlotte, Jacksonville, Memphis, Nashville, and Richmond. Corporate servers were seized, financial records were secured, and training materials were preserved before the company could destroy evidence. At each location, agents found identical patterns of discrimination, identical training protocols, and identical financial incentive structures. The systematic nature of the conspiracy was undeniable, and Pemberton's decision to fight, rather than cooperate, had just guaranteed that federal prosecutors would seek maximum criminal penalties. Dr. Martinez, who had remained at the pharmacy throughout the investigation, received a call that would prove the global reach of the discrimination network. "Agents," she said, approaching the federal team, "I just heard from my colleague at Peterson's Pharmacy in Charlotte. Federal agents are there too, and they're finding the same incident reports, the same training materials, and the same pattern of harassment complaints." The multi-state coordination confirmed that Blackstone Securities' discrimination network was even more extensive than originally suspected. Federal prosecutors would ultimately document systematic civil rights violations at 847 retail locations across 7 states, affecting an estimated 12,000 individual victims over a 3-year period. As news of the federal raids broke on social media, the hashtag Dutcher Blackstone Racism exploded with new testimonials from victims across the country. People who had been harassed, detained, and humiliated by Blackstone security guards began sharing their stories, creating a digital archive of systematic discrimination that would provide federal prosecutors with thousands of additional witnesses. Richard Pemberton's decision to fight rather than cooperate had just transformed a civil rights investigation into the largest criminal conspiracy case in private security history. The consequences would be swift, comprehensive, and devastating for everyone involved in creating and maintaining the discrimination network. But what federal agents found during the raids would expose an even darker truth about how deep this conspiracy really went. At exactly 6 a.m. Eastern Time, federal agents simultaneously breached the doors of Blackstone security offices across 7 states. The coordinated raids were the largest civil rights operation in FBI history, involving 127 agents, 43 locations, and evidence collection that would fill 3 tractor-trailers with documents, hard drives, and training materials. In Atlanta, Agent Patricia Wong led a team of forensic accountants into Blackstone's corporate headquarters, while Richard Pemberton watched from his office window as his empire was systematically dismantled. The search warrant was comprehensive, authorizing seizure of all financial records, employee files, training materials, communication systems, and corporate databases dating back 5 years. "Sir," Agent Wong announced as her team entered Pemberton's office, "we have a federal search warrant for all premises and materials related to Blackstone Securities operations. You are not under arrest at this time, but I strongly advise you to contact your attorney." Pemberton stood silently as agents photographed his office, seized his computers, and secured filing cabinets that contained the kind of evidence that would later prove criminal conspiracy at the highest corporate levels. His decision to reject federal cooperation had just guaranteed that every incriminating document, email, and financial record would become public evidence in criminal court proceedings. But it was what agents found in the corporate training center that would prove most damaging to Blackstone's defense. Agent Rebecca Martinez discovered a locked filing cabinet in the training director's office that contained what prosecutors would later call the smoking gun, detailed psychological profiles of minority customers designed to maximize harassment while minimizing legal liability. The documents included racial stereotyping guides, demographic targeting maps, and performance metrics that explicitly rewarded guards for interactions with black customers. "Agent Wong," Martinez called out, "you need to see this immediately." The psychological profiles were sophisticated and deeply disturbing. Corporate psychologists had developed behavioral analysis guides that taught security guards to interpret normal shopping behaviors as suspicious activities when exhibited by minority customers. Looking at price tags became casing merchandise for theft. Comparing products became seeking items for fraudulent returns. Using mobile phones became coordinating with criminal associates. But the most damaging evidence was a series of corporate memos marked confidential legal strategy that proved Blackstone's executives had been fully aware their practices violated federal civil rights laws. The memos discussed acceptable risk levels for civil rights violations and calculated the cost-benefit analysis of systematic discrimination versus compliance with federal law. One memo, dated just 3 months earlier, was particularly incriminating. Current litigation costs for civil rights settlements, $2. $3 million annually, remain significantly below additional revenue generated through enhanced security interventions, $14.7 million annually. Legal Department recommends maintaining current operational protocols while strengthening documentation procedures to improve legal defensibility. The memo provided mathematical proof that Blackstone Security had consciously chosen to violate civil rights laws because the financial benefits exceeded the legal costs. It transformed the case from potential discrimination into proven criminal conspiracy. Meanwhile, in Charlotte, agents discovered Blackstone's customer profiling database, a detailed electronic surveillance network that tracked personal information about minority customers across all client locations. The database contained names, addresses, physical descriptions, shopping patterns, and risk assessments for over 47,000 individuals who had never committed crimes but had been systematically targeted because of their race. Agent David Reynolds, leading the Charlotte raid, immediately recognized the legal implications. "This isn't just discrimination," he told his team. "This is domestic surveillance of American citizens based solely on racial profiling. We're looking at potential federal surveillance statute violations in addition to civil rights charges." The database revelations would later prompt congressional hearings about the use of private security companies for domestic surveillance and would result in new federal legislation regulating how private companies collect and use personal information about American citizens. Back at the Peterson's pharmacy, Wade Montenegro was providing additional testimony about the database system. "Every guard had access to the profiling system through our mobile devices," he explained to Agent Griffin. "When we saw someone who matched a profile, we were supposed to immediately initiate proactive security engagement and document the interaction for performance review." The mobile profiling system meant that Blackstone security guards had been carrying electronic racial profiling tools that allowed them to instantly identify and target minority customers across multiple locations. The technological sophistication of the discrimination network would prove that this was not the result of individual prejudice, but a carefully designed corporate strategy. Agent Nova Weatherby was coordinating evidence analysis from all 7 states when she made a discovery that would expand the federal investigation even further. "Tyrone," she called out, "we need to contact the Treasury Department. Blackstone has been using civil forfeiture laws to seize property from customers they falsely accused of crimes." The civil forfeiture abuse added another layer to the criminal conspiracy. Blackstone Security had been working with local law enforcement to seize money, jewelry, and personal property from minority customers who were falsely accused of theft or fraud. The seized property was then split between local police departments and Blackstone through asset-sharing agreements that generated additional revenue from systematic discrimination. Federal financial analysts would later document that Blackstone Security had participated in the seizure of over $3.7 million in property from individuals who were never convicted of crimes, with 89% of the seizures involving minority victims. As evidence piled up from raids across 7 states, Richard Pemberton's decision to reject federal cooperation appeared increasingly catastrophic. What had begun as a civil rights investigation had evolved into a multi-state criminal conspiracy involving surveillance violations, financial fraud, civil rights violations, and abuse of civil forfeiture laws. The scope of criminal exposure now potentially included RICO charges, conspiracy to violate civil rights, fraud, illegal surveillance, and deprivation of rights under color of law. Charges that could result in decades of federal prison time for corporate executives who had created and maintained the discrimination network. But what happened next would prove that some crimes are too big to hide, and some truths are too powerful to suppress. 6 weeks after Wade Montenegro pointed a gun at Agent Nora Griffin in an Atlanta pharmacy, the largest federal civil rights prosecution in private security history began with 17 simultaneous indictments across 7 states. The scope of the charges was unprecedented. Criminal conspiracy, civil rights violations, illegal surveillance, financial fraud, and RICO violations affecting an estimated 47,000 victims over 5 years. Richard Pemberton was arrested at his Buckhead mansion at 6 a.m. by federal agents, while news helicopters circled overhead. The perp walk of the 70-year-old CEO being led away in handcuffs became the defining image of corporate accountability in the digital age, shared millions of times across social media platforms with hashtags that would trend globally for weeks. His son Marcus was arrested simultaneously at his Midtown office, along with 15 other executives who had created, implemented, or profited from the systematic discrimination network. The coordinated arrests were designed to prevent document destruction and witness intimidation, while sending a clear message that corporate executives would be held personally accountable for civil rights violations. But it was the victim impact statements that would prove most powerful in demonstrating the human cost of Blackstone's corporate conspiracy. Dawn Patterson took the stand first, her voice steady but emotional, as she described the impact of systematic harassment on her family. "My son David is 18 years old. He should be thinking about college, about his future, about becoming the doctor he's always wanted to be. Instead, he's afraid to go shopping alone because he's been followed, questioned, and humiliated so many times by security guards who saw him as a criminal instead of an honor student." Her testimony was followed by dozens of other victims who described similar experiences. Parents whose children had been traumatized by harassment, students whose academic performance had suffered due to anxiety caused by constant surveillance, working professionals who had been humiliated in front of colleagues and clients. The cumulative impact was devastating. Federal prosecutors had documented a pattern of psychological terrorism that had affected entire communities, creating environments where law-abiding citizens lived in fear of harassment based solely on their race. Agent Griffin testified about the federal investigation, explaining how Blackstone's systematic discrimination had violated core American principles of equal protection under law. "This case represents more than individual acts of prejudice," she told the jury. "It represents a corporate decision to profit from racism while hiding behind the false legitimacy of private security services." But it was Wade Montenegro's testimony that proved most compelling to federal jurors. The former security guard had spent 6 months in federal custody, providing detailed information about Blackstone's operations while participating in counseling programs designed to address the prejudicial attitudes that had been exploited by corporate training. "I want to be clear about something," Wade said, his voice breaking with emotion. "Nobody forced me to point that gun at Agent Griffin. Nobody forced me to harass Dawn Patterson's son or follow innocent people around stores like they were criminals. I made those choices. But what I want people to understand is that Blackstone Security took my prejudices and turned them into a business plan." Wade's testimony provided jurors with insight into how corporate discrimination networks recruit and exploit individual prejudices for systematic civil rights violations. His transformation from perpetrator to witness demonstrated both personal accountability and the possibility of redemption through truth-telling and genuine remorse. The defense strategy employed by Blackstone's legal team proved counterproductive. Rather than accepting responsibility and seeking leniency, corporate attorneys argued that discrimination was the result of rogue employees acting against company policy, despite overwhelming evidence of systematic corporate conspiracy. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges against all defendants. The speed of the deliberation reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence and the jury's recognition that Blackstone Security had operated a criminal enterprise designed to profit from racial discrimination. Sentencing hearings revealed the full scope of consequences for corporate executives who had created the discrimination network. Richard Pemberton received 18 years in federal prison, the longest sentence ever imposed for civil rights violations in corporate security. His son, Marcus, received 12 years. Regional directors and training supervisors received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. But the criminal sentences were only the beginning of justice for Blackstone's victims. Federal civil rights settlements totaled $247 million, the largest civil rights payout in private security history. The settlement funds were distributed to identified victims based on the severity and duration of harassment they had experienced, with additional funds designated for community programs designed to address the psychological impact of systematic discrimination. Corporate restructuring requirements were equally comprehensive. Blackstone Security was dissolved as a corporate entity, with its assets transferred to a new company operating under permanent federal oversight. All former executives were permanently banned from employment in private security services. New training programs were implemented that emphasized civil rights compliance and anti-discrimination protocols. But perhaps most importantly, the Blackstone case prompted congressional action that resulted in the Private Security Accountability Act, federal legislation that required licensing, background checks, and civil rights training for all private security personnel operating in interstate commerce. The law included provisions for federal monitoring of private security companies, mandatory reporting of discrimination complaints, and criminal penalties for corporate executives who create or maintain discriminatory practices. It represented the most comprehensive reform of private security regulation since the industry's creation. Agent Griffin, who had risked her life to expose the discrimination network, was promoted to lead the newly created Federal Civil Rights Enforcement Division, a specialized unit designed to investigate systematic discrimination in corporate environments. Wade Montenegro was sentenced to 3 years of supervised probation and 2,000 hours of community service, primarily involving speaking to law enforcement groups about the dangers of racial profiling and the personal cost of prejudice. His cooperation had been essential to the federal prosecution, and his genuine remorse had convinced judges that rehabilitation was possible. But the final chapter of this story would prove that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about transformation. 2 years after Wade Montenegro pointed a gun at Agent Nora Griffin, the ripple effects of their confrontation had transformed not just individual lives, but entire systems of corporate accountability and civil rights enforcement across the United States. The Peterson's Pharmacy on Peachtree Street had become an unlikely pilgrimage site for civil rights advocates, marked by a small plaque that read, "On this site, courage confronted conspiracy, and truth prevailed over prejudice." Dr. Martinez had requested the plaque, explaining to reporters that the pharmacy's staff wanted to honor both the victims of discrimination and the federal agents who had exposed systematic injustice. Agent Griffin stood in that same pharmacy on the 2nd anniversary of the incident, reflecting on how a routine cold medicine purchase had evolved into a case that redefined corporate civil rights enforcement. She was now director of the Federal Civil Rights Enforcement Division, leading a team of 247 agents across 12 field offices specializing in systematic discrimination investigations. The Blackstone case taught us that civil rights violations in corporate America aren't isolated incidents, she explained to a gathering of law enforcement officials and civil rights advocates. They're often systematic programs designed to generate profit through discrimination while maintaining plausible legal deniability. The Enforcement Division had already opened investigations into systematic discrimination at 47 other companies, using investigative techniques pioneered during the Blackstone case. Federal agents were now trained to recognize the financial incentive structures, training protocols, and performance metrics that indicated potential civil rights violations. Wade Montenegro had completed his community service requirements and was now employed as a civil rights compliance specialist for the reformed security company that had emerged from Blackstone's assets. His job involved training new security personnel to recognize and prevent discriminatory practices while maintaining effective security services for legitimate business purposes. "Every day I meet with new security guards and I tell them my story," Wade explained during a recent interview. "I tell them how corporate training turned my prejudices into criminal actions and how those actions destroyed my life and hurt innocent people. Most importantly, I tell them that they have a choice about who they become and what they stand for." Wade's transformation had been genuine and comprehensive. He had completed racial bias counseling, earned a college degree in criminal justice, and had become a powerful advocate for civil rights training in private security services. His speaking engagements at police academies and security training programs had reached over 15,000 law enforcement personnel. Dawn Patterson and her son David had used their portion of the federal settlement to establish the Patterson Foundation for Civil Rights Education, a non-profit organization that provided scholarships for minority students pursuing careers in law enforcement and civil rights law. The foundation had awarded $2.3 million in scholarships over 2 years, helping to diversify law enforcement agencies and civil rights organizations. We decided that the best way to honor what we went through was to help create a future where what happened to David doesn't happen to other children, Dawn explained during the foundation's second annual scholarship ceremony. Every young person we help become a police officer or civil rights lawyer is someone who will protect others from discrimination. David Patterson was now a sophomore at Georgia State University, majoring in criminal justice, with plans to attend law school and specialize in civil rights prosecution. His experience with systematic harassment had motivated him to dedicate his career to preventing similar injustices. The broader impact of the Blackstone case extended far beyond individual lives. Corporate America had taken notice of the unprecedented criminal sentences imposed on executives who created discriminatory systems. The case had become a mandatory study topic in business schools, law schools, and corporate compliance programs nationwide. Major retail chains had voluntarily reformed their security protocols, implementing civil rights training programs, bias reporting systems, and performance metrics that explicitly prohibited discrimination-based interactions with customers. The cost of potential federal prosecution had proven more effective than decades of civil rights advocacy in motivating corporate compliance. Dr. Martinez had used her experience during the federal investigation to develop new protocols for healthcare providers who witnessed discrimination. The American Pharmacy Association had adopted her recommendations as national standards, requiring pharmacists to report suspected discrimination and providing protection for healthcare providers who intervene to protect patients' civil rights. Congressional oversight had resulted in expanded federal civil rights enforcement budgets and new legislation that made corporate executives personally liable for systematic discrimination in their companies. The Private Security Accountability Act had been strengthened twice since its original passage, creating federal licensing requirements and mandatory background checks for all private security personnel. But perhaps the most significant transformation was in how American society understood the relationship between individual prejudice and systematic discrimination. The Blackstone case had demonstrated that corporate policies could weaponize personal biases to create systematic injustice while providing legal cover for discriminatory actions. As Agent Griffin concluded her remarks at the pharmacy anniversary ceremony, she reflected on the broader meaning of the case that had defined her career. What happened here wasn't just about one security guard with a gun or one federal agent with a badge. It was about the choice every person faces when confronted with injustice, whether to look away or stand up, whether to enable discrimination or expose it, whether to prioritize personal safety or collective justice. The ceremony concluded with a moment of silence for all victims of systematic discrimination, followed by the unveiling of a new civil rights training center that would be housed in the renovated Peterson's Pharmacy building. The Civil Rights Training Center would provide free education to law enforcement officers, security personnel, and community members, ensuring that the lessons learned from the Blackstone case would continue educating future generations about the dangers of systematic discrimination and the power of individual courage to expose corporate injustice. Wade Montenegro approached Agent Griffin after the ceremony, carrying a framed photograph of the original pharmacy security camera footage that had captured their confrontation. The image showed the moment when his gun was pressed against her forehead, but also captured the dozen customers who had recorded everything, creating the evidence that would ultimately bring down an entire discrimination network. "Agent Griffin," he said quietly, "I wanted to give you this. It's a reminder that sometimes the worst moments in our lives can become the most important. What happened that day destroyed my old life, but it gave me the chance to build something better." Agent Griffin accepted the photograph, noting how the image captured both the horror of systematic discrimination and the courage required to confront it. The fear in the customer's eyes, the determination in her own posture, and the rage in Wade's face told the complete story of how individual prejudice had been weaponized by corporate policies designed to generate profit through human suffering. "Wade, what you did that day was terrible and could have cost me my life," she replied with characteristic honesty. But what you've done since then, the testimony that exposed the conspiracy, the education work that's reaching thousands of law enforcement officers, the genuine commitment to preventing others from following your path, that's shown me that people can transform themselves when they're willing to face the truth about their actions. The exchange between former adversaries had become a symbol of the possibility for redemption and reconciliation when justice is coupled with genuine accountability and personal transformation. Their relationship had evolved from victim and perpetrator to colleagues working together to prevent systematic discrimination in corporate environments. Dawn Patterson joined them, accompanied by her son David, who was now preparing for law school with plans to specialize in civil rights prosecution. David had grown from a frightened teenager who was afraid to shop alone into a confident young man determined to protect others from experiencing the harassment that had shaped his adolescence. "Agent Griffin," Dawn said, "I want to thank you not just for what you did that day, but for showing David that courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it's standing up to a man with a gun. Sometimes it's choosing to study law so you can protect others from what happened to you." David Patterson had been accepted to Harvard Law School with a full scholarship funded by the settlement from the Blackstone case. His personal statement about experiencing systematic discrimination while watching federal agents risk their lives to expose injustice had impressed admissions committees and civil rights organizations nationwide. He would graduate with the knowledge and motivation to prevent other families from experiencing the trauma that had defined his teenage years. "Agent Griffin," David said, "when I was 15 years old, watching that security guard threaten you while my mother and I hid behind vitamin displays, I thought the world was a place where people could hurt others without consequences. What I learned from watching your investigation was that justice is possible when people are willing to fight for it, even when it puts their own lives at risk." The three generations represented by Dawn Patterson, Agent Griffin, and David Patterson embodied the broader transformation that had resulted from the Blackstone case. Victims had become advocates, perpetrators had become educators, and a single act of courage in a pharmacy had rippled outward to create systematic changes in corporate accountability, federal law enforcement, and individual lives across the country. Dr. Martinez, who had maintained the pharmacy as a functioning business throughout the federal investigation and subsequent legal proceedings, approached the group with news that would provide a fitting conclusion to the story. "Agent Griffin, I wanted you to be the first to know. The American Pharmacy Association has just announced the Nora Griffin Award for healthcare professionals who demonstrate courage in protecting civil rights. The annual award would recognize healthcare providers who risk their careers and safety to protect patients from discrimination, harassment, or abuse. Recipients would receive financial support for continuing education in civil rights law and would be invited to speak at national conferences about the intersection of healthcare and social justice. The award represented institutional recognition that healthcare providers have both the opportunity and responsibility to intervene when they witness systematic discrimination. As the sun set over downtown Atlanta, casting golden light through the windows of the former Peterson's pharmacy, Agent Griffin reflected on how a simple purchase of cold medicine had evolved into a transformation of corporate accountability, federal civil rights enforcement, and individual lives across the United States. The Blackstone case had proven that systematic injustice could be exposed and defeated when individuals chose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, and collective justice over personal safety. It had demonstrated that corporate conspiracies could be unraveled by federal investigators willing to risk their lives for civil rights, and that even those who had participated in discrimination could find redemption through genuine accountability and service to others. Most importantly, it had shown that in America, no one, regardless of race, background, or circumstances, should have to face injustice alone. When individuals stand up for what's right, when federal agents risk their lives to expose systematic discrimination, and when communities come together to demand accountability, transformation becomes not just possible, but inevitable. The pharmacy incident that began with Wade Montenegro pointing a gun at Agent Nora Griffin had ended with the largest civil rights prosecution in private security history, the creation of new federal legislation protecting Americans from systematic discrimination, and the transformation of individual lives through justice, accountability, and redemption. Richard Pemberton and his co-conspirators remained in federal prison, serving sentences that reflected the severity of their crimes against civil rights and human dignity. Their corporate empire had been dismantled, its assets redistributed to victims, and transformed into institutions dedicated to preventing the very injustices they had created. Wade Montenegro continued his work as a civil rights educator, speaking to thousands of law enforcement officers about the dangers of racial profiling and the possibility of personal transformation through truth-telling and service to others. His journey from perpetrator to advocate had become a powerful example of how individuals can change when confronted with the consequences of their actions and given the opportunity to make amends. Dawn Patterson and her son David had established a foundation that would help hundreds of young people pursue careers in civil rights law and law enforcement, ensuring that future generations would be protected by advocates who understood the personal cost of discrimination and the importance of institutional accountability. Agent Nora Griffin led a federal division that had already prevented dozens of other systematic discrimination networks from causing similar harm to American communities, using investigative techniques and legal strategies developed during the Blackstone prosecution to identify and dismantle corporate policies designed to profit from prejudice. The Petersons Pharmacy building now served as a civil rights training center that educated thousands of security personnel, law enforcement officers, and community members about recognizing and preventing discrimination in all its forms. The center's existence ensured that the lessons learned from one moment of confrontation would continue protecting Americans from systematic injustice for generations to come. But perhaps most importantly, the case had demonstrated to millions of Americans that systematic injustice could be exposed and defeated when individuals chose to stand up for what's right, regardless of personal risk or consequences. It had proven that in a democracy, justice depends not on perfect institutions or flawless individuals, but on ordinary people who refuse to accept discrimination as normal, who choose courage when confronted with injustice, and who believe that all Americans deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. The transformation that began in an Atlanta pharmacy, with a federal agent buying cold medicine, had rippled outward to change corporate policies, federal laws, and individual lives across the United States. It proved that in America, when truth confronts power and courage faces down conspiracy, justice doesn't just survive, it prevails. Thank you to everyone who hyped this video and shared their locations from around the world. When you hit hype, you're telling YouTube that stories of courage and justice matter. If these incredible tales inspire you, please subscribe and keep hyping our content to help us reach more people who need to hear these stories. Until next time, keep believing in the power of truth.